All right, how many of you, when you think about hotbeds of design, of good design, think about government? All right. Mike Bracken has become a dear friend, and to me is one of the most inspiring figures, not just in the design world, but in the digital world. The work that he did at the UK Government Digital Service is really about putting people at the center of government services, and it's had an enormous influence. My wife's nonprofit, Code for America, has been deeply influenced when she was the deputy CTO of the US and helped set up what's known as the United States Digital Service. It was really a direct homage to Mike's work in the UK. And I like to think that the UK design principles, government design principles, really should be read by any organization. And so I want to just sort of turn it over to Mike here to talk a little bit about what you were doing, why you were doing it, and how you put all the pieces together.
Thanks, Tim. Hello. I think I should firstly say it was done by a lot of people, so some of them are here today, and I'll try and mention them. But can I just ask first, who knows about Government Digital Service and gov.uk? That's a fair few people. Who's British? Great. You're not allowed to ask difficult questions, okay? I think what I'd like to do maybe, Tim, is give a minute of context where we found ourselves and how we started, and then maybe show a video which would help. Just a moment on context. The Government Digital Service was created in 2010-11 when we had a new coalition government came in, and we found ourselves, as many governments, with a bunch of problems. We had no money, or not enough money. We had a lot of unhappy users inside and outside of the system. People didn't really like the difference between what they were getting in their personal lives and what they were getting from government. And we had the constant problems of procurement and security. And what we did, we started the Government Digital Service, we put it right in the middle of government, and we gave it some powers, particularly domain power, which nobody else wanted, actually, in our system. And we... What
he means by that is the ability to turn on or turn off a government website.
Yeah. But when I got to government as an anecdote, people said, oh, what powers do you want? Do you want money and a big office? And I was like, no, domain power will do fine. So
you could shut down services that didn't work.
Yeah. So we closed down about 2,000 of those. And we had to think about, well, we've got this one-off chance to do this. How are we going to do it? And we thought very early on that design was the organizing principle of our organization. If we were going to be known for one thing, it was going to be design. Because not only did we have to design public services, which is a huge challenge and the rallying call to everybody, we had to design the organization that had never existed before to do that task. And it had to be designed in a way which is inherently scalable. There's 440,000 colleagues in the British Civil Service on that date when we started, and you can't meet all of them. So we've got to design an entire system of communication standards, which we tried to do. And maybe then if you can watch the little video, I might tell you a minute on how we did some of that.
Sure. Can you guys run the video? So one of the things you'll see there is design isn't about pretty. Design, although it's a clean site, it's really about how do you think about what people want. And how many people here have ever gone to a government website and, first of all, been confronted by lots of press releases about the government officials, and secondly, gone through a maze of twisty little passages only to find you were in the wrong one, waited an hour on a phone queue or in a line and discovered it was the wrong place? Well, that's what you guys went and fixed.
Yeah.
Can you talk about some of the results, like what actually was different before and after?
Sure. Well, again, as you say, when we got there, incredibly complex. Large organizations, governments particularly, follow their own dominant logic. So we try and create things that look like our own structures. And we've forgotten in government that actually users only really have one need of government, which is at the point of need to recognize it's the government, not 330 agency brand names or 28 departmental names, which is what we had, because it's quite arrogant to presume that you as a user have to understand how government is structured in order to deal with government. So the first user need was start to redesign services with the assumption that the user would tell you what you want and you would give it to them. It's not exactly groundbreaking, but we had to sort of
in government, it is completely groundbreaking, as are all of your principles. By the way, did you want to put the principles up on the slide? You have a slide. And by the way, there's going to be a drill down later up in the chapel at 4 o'clock with Ben Terrett, who actually wrote the GDS Design Principles document.
Ben's here, and Ben and Francis with him deserve a lot of credit. There's a lot of people worked on this design work, and Ben led the entire design effort. And the design principles there show you, number one is user needs. And recognizing that in government was actually quite profound. And that allowed us to start looking with an open eye on what people were actually doing in government. And we found we had roughly 30 to 40% of our content, just stuff we were publishing, that no one was looking at, ever. So we got rid of that.
Well, that's also one of your other points, design with data and do less. Both of those, you kind of just went, nobody's using this stuff. We can see.
Yes.
And
and then once you start thinking that way, it leads you to some very interesting places. So we start looking at the questions. Everything's driven by user research. We're constantly talking to users. And one of the questions is, what are users asking for, particularly digitally? And we found out that you can guess some of the questions, like, how do I get a permit for this? Where do I pay my taxes? How do I get a benefit? They're not difficult questions to guess at, but we weren't answering those questions because we had all this policy stuff and all this press stuff. So even very basic questions like, when's the next bank holiday? As public servants, we're very interested in the next free holiday. And so we said, when's the next one? The government's got the official record of that. But actually, the question most people are asking is not, give me a list of them. It's like, when's the next one? So on the first page, when you type in bank holidays to Google, Gov.uk would present you a massive image going, the next one is August the 26th, or whatever date it is. And you can find the others and so on. And what we found is by designing simple answers to often asked questions, we were meeting the needs of millions of people first time. We saw people's dwell time massively reduced because they'd got what they want and they could go about their business. And we started to apply that sort of thinking to information provision. Governments have written stuff in a way that is incomprehensible for such a long time that we have got used to it. So we started to put government policy documents in front of people who needed to use them to find out that they couldn't understand them. So we designed a profession called content design, which is a combination of a bit of pure design, writing in a certain style. Writing for the web is quite difficult, and working with designers and developers to actually look at millions of words of policy and rewrite them in ways that people understood, test them with users, and then make that the definitive way we design services. Unsurprisingly, we could design things in such a small and concise way that we could present them really elegantly. So you didn't have to read a 50-page PDF anymore. You could get it one paragraph and find out what you wanted to. And so we did things like that by following our own principles, which you'll see behind me here. And then finally, we then started to look at transactions. If you apply the same models of simplicity and design based on user needs to your transactions, you find you can remodel those to make them very simple as well. And it's that combination of really elegant design thinking, user research, and simplicity which led us to GovUK, which is our first publishing platform.
Right, so basically you reduced the number of UK government websites, but increased the amount of traffic, the number of transactions. Can you kind of talk about a little bit about the stats?
Yeah.
And the cost.
The cost. Stats. So we came to government. Government is, in our country, is federated. We have a cabinet system of government, 28 departments and so on. There is no record of how many transactions we have, not by volume, just by type. So we had to count them, 782. And then we had to do some analysis and break them down, who's using them, how much, and so on. And then we found out that 90% of users use the top 50. 90% use the top 25, 97% the top 50. So we focused on those. We drove traffic. We have now, I think, in the just over a year and a half, 1 billion user visits, and the number of transactions rose exponentially. We published it. Well, the first thing we did was to count the actual transactions, the user type, and publish them in the open. So one of our second platforms was GovUK/performance. You can have a look today, and you'll see live usage numbers of people getting a driving license or paying tax or so on. So we put the numbers in the open as a yardstick about how well we were performing, and that allowed all parts of government for the first time to know, in relation to other transactions, whether the numbers were right and going up and so on. Yeah,
it reminds me of a conversation I had with somebody 4 or 5 years ago at the US federal level, and I said, do you when you spend millions of dollars on a website, do you know how many people use it? And this official said, wow, that would be a good idea. And it was it's just staggering, but we've come a long way. Here in the U.S., we had a crisis with healthcare.gov, which led to the formation. First of all, there was a rescue team that was recruited from Silicon Valley, and then that led to the formation of 2 new groups, one at the White House, which is known as the United States Digital Service, and one at the General Services Administration, which is called 18F, from the original address of their first office. And both of them are recruiting designers. So if you have a call to public service, and of course there's Code for America, which works with local and now increasingly state government on the design of digital services for government. And check all of them out. They're all recruiting, and it's a real opportunity to make a difference. But back to the UK and what you're doing there. You saved the UK government quite a lot of money as well. Yeah, we saved, audited by Treasury, we saved 4.1 billion out of the UK public purse, which is substantial for an organization it took us 3 years to get to an annual budget of 50 million, so you're getting quite a rate of return there. It's not that difficult once you start thinking this way. So, when we first started by saying we're going to challenge the dominant logic in most large organizations is you start with policy or you start with procurement, and they are pretty lousy ways to serve users generally. They have their uses, but they're not really focused on users. So we started with design and design of services, and it's yielded billions of pounds worth of revenue, and that's pounds, that's proper money, So it's it's kind of interesting because I think a lot of large organizations could benefit from the same kind of Mike Bracken diet. You should actually have thought about this sort of. Publish a book called The Government Diet, and that might have been a path to this as well. But I am thinking of an interaction I had recently with a large financial firm. I spent an hour on the phone only to find that sort of shunted from one office to another, none of whom knew the correct answer, and finally somebody said, "Oh, you just have to download this form," and crazy. These organizations haven't really looked at their own data to say, well, what are people really looking for? And that was sort of one of the things we took at Code for America. Look at the search logs. Start there. Prioritize. It's not the stuff that the government puts front and center. No, it isn't. And this is where multidisciplinary teams are important. I suspect some people visiting the conference today will be thinking about how to bring design into their organizations. I believe many people in large organizations face similar problems. These problems of government are not unique. Yeah. And
you know, I'd like to say two things on that. Firstly, multidisciplinary teams. We didn't just go and get some designers and say, sit there and do this. You know, we had to surround teams with designers, developers, user research, content designers, people who are good with data, analysts, going in teams of 10, 12, 15 and working that way. The preeminent model within that team was to design a new service, but the team wasn't all designers. We had to teach our designers to code. There are many types of design, and I don't know a lot about much design, but I don't see how you can be a designer of services if you can't code. If you don't know JavaScript, you haven't got some idea of that. So we had to do a lot of that work. And for me, the most blurred line is between design and front-end devs. You know, it should be hard to tell the difference, frankly.
Yeah.
So that was the first thing.
Well, there were other parts though, like the language design. I remember the first time I visited GDS, and you had a big board of all the words that were not allowed. You know, the bureaucratic speak. You know, that was just sort of like, and you were continually building the vocabulary of how you could talk to users. And
I mean, we were man-marked in many respects as an organization. So I would often come across people who say, you know, you can't do that. That's our job. So I'd say, what's it called? This thing we can't do? And they'd say, it's called X. And I'd say, oh, no, we don't do that. We do design X. And they go, okay. You know, you just have to use it as a metaphor sometimes. So we did that. But I mean, the other thing,
I remember you also, going back to the domain power, I think one of the really great tricks that you pulled off was that notion that you had the authority over the domain name. So, you know, again, maybe correct me if I'm wrong in this, you know, you would stand up a new service, you'd get users for it, it would actually be competing with some other existing service, and when you had lots of good new users for it, and you knew it worked, you'd turn off the old one, and they would go, what do you mean? You just turned off our website. You go, yeah, they go here now. You know, and you know, that jujitsu of which it's very hard, you know, you think about in the private sector, you know, somebody comes up with a startup that disrupts an incumbent, you know, the users migrate, but it's very hard to do in a government context. And I think there's a really interesting play around how do you build an alternate service and then switch people over when you know it works.
Sure. I should have been sacked on several occasions formally because, you know, you just took it too far and went, just turn it off. But because millions of people, tens of hundreds of thousands of people are using it already, it's sort of hard to argue. You'd be going like, we've done this. I remember one early on, we were doing something for imports. We're an island, and obviously importation is important. It's deeply complicated about how things come in and out. And we had 40 days of mithering with procurement of like, oh, you can't do this. You can't. I said, I'll just build it. And we built it and then lived it. And it was like, how on earth can you work on a prototype? It's like, it's not a prototype. And, well, how can you design an alpha? It's not an alpha. It's been working since Thursday. You know, and you had that moment and you thought, well, a minister could quite conceivably say, that's a bit too much. You can't be doing that. But the point is because they were so elegant, because they've been designed so well, people like them. It's very hard to sort of punish people who've created stuff that people like, particularly in a political system.
So you also had good top-level sponsorship, and that was super important.
Francis Moore, the minister responsible, was there through the Parliament, was absolutely, you know, he did something very unusual politicians never do. When we had a report at the start called Digital by Default, which was the precursor to setting up the government digital service, and most politicians look at it and pick the bits they like, the report, and he just read it, said, yeah, let's do all of that then. And he was an absolute rock throughout it, so we needed that support.
So, and I think about that, you know, in a commercial setting, you know, Jeff Bezos, for example, when he remade Amazon from an application into a platform, you know, he had that, you know, absolute authority to say, you know, you know, you're going to do this or you're going to be fired. And Francis kind of had that kind of weight of like, get out of the way. And again, rare in an organization to have that much sponsorship. But anyway, so let's talk about your new gig, which is really the remaking of another old gig.
We've got lots of old things in the UK. So Ben and I and a couple of colleagues have gone to the Co-operative Group, which is the largest, I think the largest or second largest cooperative organization in the world. It's a £10 billion organization. We have classic conglomerate model, retail, insurance, legal, so on. But it's owned by its members. We don't pay a dividend to shareholders. The dividend, when we pay it, goes back into members, and we fund an enormous number of community activities around the country, and we fund a lot of people to do that work as well. So it's a member-owned organization.
Healthcare.
We're building a couple of schools at the moment, doing that sort of thing. And the model has been around since, it's as old as the Industrial Revolution. The organization was formed because the social and economic conditions of capitalism in the early Industrial Revolution in the north of England were not conducive to healthy living. And so it was a nakedly commercial organization, but formed to protect people who were workers in that industrial system. The model has been around a long time. It's been quite unfashionable for the last 20 years, but I suspect it's coming back into fashion largely because people are now seeing a great degree of utility in the digital economy, where we all love the stuff we're getting, but there's a whole bunch of social stuff that maybe is lacking as well. So we're having a go at that.
Yeah, there's been a whole lot of talk, for example, in the on-demand economy, in services like Uber and Lyft. Why aren't these owned by the drivers? And in some sense, whether you're going to tackle that particular one, the notion here is to take an organization started in 1850 and say, okay, what are the digital equivalents of these cooperative arrangements that were made, back in the 1850s?
Yes.
And that's super interesting. I mean, there's a lot of people, there's this term, if you guys haven't heard, platform cooperativism, that's being bandied about, and anybody who's interested in that, you should connect with Mike, because you actually are trying to build that on the back of an existing large-scale cooperative, one of the largest in the world.
I mean, it'll come as no surprise we're putting design thinking at the start of that, but it leads you to some very interesting questions. If you have 5 million members, a £10 billion organization, and you can work at scale, the biggest single problem is, remember you talking to Doug Cutting some years ago, the biggest single problem in this space is scale. We have scale, community scale, and membership scale. So how do you then design services which create positive feedback loops, reward users, and create a genuine sense of community? There's too many false binaries around. The sharing economy is nothing of the sort. And I'm not sure this, I also think there's a streak of thinking about cooperativism as a sort of false binary, as some for us to win and do this, Uber doesn't have to lose. That's a false binary. I think we're a deeply commercial organization, and we will remain so. But we just want to create that added social value that isn't working at the moment. Well,
and there's the whole B Corp movement that overlaps with that, and this sort of notion that we actually need to rethink the fundamental structure of organizations so that they're actually serving people and not just financial markets. And I think that thread of people first, is central to user-centered design, but it's also central to this sort of, hey, let's reform government so that it really is, to use the American phrasing, wonderful phrasing of Abraham Lincoln, of, for, and by the people. But also, in an organization like this, how do we make new kinds of economic entities that put their customers first rather than financial institutions first? So,
the questions we're asking are like, if you think of community assets and services, what happens if you digitize those with this model at scale? So, Airbnb, which interestingly was started by 2 designers, has done that for private landlords. Well, what happens if you do that? Think about that for community space.
Public buildings,
parks. What about all those community buildings which are hard to find, hard to lease, you want to use them for an hour? What if there's a market there for that, but the commercial model underpinning it creates more investment back into that model? I think we can all recognize that sort of thinking hasn't been applied by our existing platform organization.
Well, or if you can rent that community space, but it's sort of totally fragmented. You have to know which particular government agency to go to, and could you make a platform for public space? I think that's a great idea. You're going to bring that over to the U.S.? Or some Silicon Valley startup?
As soon as it's ready, And but if you think that's a connection to the last job, if you think about that, the cost of maintaining discrete booking systems for the thousands of bits of government that have to do that in the UK is ridiculous. But if you had a platform that said, look, that's sort of a public service. Now, by the way, these are just ideas. These are the things. I don't run the cooperative. It's a member-based organization. But it's important that there is somebody in the economic model and the economic system who is sort of thinking a little differently at the moment in the digital
well, this
space.
kind of goes back to my conversation with Tony Fadell yesterday, where he was pointing out that the essence of design is beginner's mind, seeing the things that everybody else takes for granted, and then going, oh, that could be different.
Yeah.
And I think in a lot of these areas, we've just sort of accept these institutions. We haven't actually figured out that, yes, we could reinvent them for the 21st century. And that's just such a tremendous and exciting challenge. So if we have any questions from the audience, just come up to the mics. Otherwise, we'll keep at this. Looks like somebody's coming up over here.
Hi, Mike. Hi, Tim. Thank you for that. I want to go back to something you said earlier about how you're in the government job, and with many of us here in organizations, particularly large organizations, are trying to bring design thinking to the forefront, trying to turn design from a small thing into something that actually leads an organization or leads a company. Have you been able to identify what that tipping point is? What is it that takes it from being a small internal renegade team to being an essential part of an organization? Delivery.
Strategy is delivery. I just absolutely fed up with designers designing pretty pictures. I just got so fed up with it. People saying, "Oh, look at my felt tips. Look, I've got this font. What do you think?" Like, for goodness sake, I just wouldn't let them in the door if they hadn't designed in code so we could launch it. It's like the problem with design teams generally is they're so esoteric from the running of the business that they're just too easy to dismiss. So having a design team that delivers was, once it's delivered a live service, it's not a design team anymore, it's a service team. And that was the biggest single change we had. And, I've had several parts of my career, and I've had this continual problem with design, which is, too many designers want to sit in a box in the corner and be creative outside of the real running of the business or the organization. So, and that's when I met Ben, I'd sort of at my wit's end, because I kept meeting designers who want to show me the stuff, and I'd be like, he talked about motorway signs. Like in Britain, we have a long tradition of civic design of infrastructure. Bazalgette and the sewers, Brindley's and the canals. We are good at this. We've been good at this for a long time. Margaret Calvert designed motorway signs. Had to use a test them because you race past them at 70 miles an hour. Can you read the font? And all around the world, those signs are used now, and that font's used, and that's a British thing. And I wanted to think about government and government digital service in that tradition of very practical design at scale, not in the tradition of sort of, look at my latest drawing sort of stuff. So the challenge for design teams was to get delivering.
Yeah, I think there's a super interesting point there, which is how closely design and delivery, are, which really leads into how you design services and the role of Agile in, in service delivery.
Yeah. Well, I'm a technologist, I guess, at heart, and technology just got easier. Many of the problems, particularly government was solving, have been solved many times over. The commoditization of technology increases so that actually you can plug some of that stuff in. That's not the hard stuff anymore. What is hard is having an agile culture where the designer can drive some of the rapid development work. And we were absolutely convinced that trying to deliver services via large procurements, writing requirements that take several years in a waterfall fashion just doesn't work. I think we've frankly proven that time and again now and taken the money out. But we had to sit designers next to developers and various types of technologists, who many of whom say, oh, it's very, very complicated, you wouldn't understand. It's like, well, if you've made it that complicated, then it's not very good. So you redesign it and actually give the design ethos more weight than the technology ethos. That is hard, but you can do it, but you need the right technology.
It's sort of interesting when you say that. I remember one time when you said, I never want to hear from a policy person without a designer and a developer. So, actually, it was a user on one side and a developer on the other side.
Yeah.
And you think about that, role of the feedback loop in getting this right. Okay, we got one last question here, and then we're going to have to wrap.
Sure. Thank you for the opportunity. I wanted to ask, what is the NHS one of the domains under your power?
No.
And what work do you plan to do with them in the future?
I plan to absolutely nothing with the NHS. And I'm delighted to say.
What would you want to do?
What would I want to? I haven't got enough time. That is the biggest single challenge in the UK, and I think globally, to bring digital. It has a strategic problem. Unless governance is sorted out, it won't work. But NHS isn't owned by, it's not a central government service in the UK, but it's the one rallying call. It's the one place where I think a generation of people need to pitch up and sort it out digitally. He says, hopefully someone else will do that.
Our equivalent here is the Veterans Administration, I think.
Yeah, which, you know what you need to do? You need to start again. That's the hard thing to do. Many institutions, actually, you need to look at them and go, keep it running for now, but just start again with a new one. I suspect there are elements of the VA, and certainly not the whole thing, because the NHS is a brand, but there are elements of our health system where we just need to start again.
Yeah. All right, well, that's actually a kind of a design rallying cry. I've always loved that line from Ezra Pound, the poet, where he said, "Make it new." Yeah. And that's really what we're doing. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.